So welcome everyone to our weekly call. We are now recording, and the topic for today is mainly going to focus on IETF 111 last week, which some of the people on this call attended, others bizarrely had other things to do with their time. So I thought it might be helpful to just highlight some of the more interesting sessions and point to some of the relevant content. So anyone that has a particular interest can sort of not have to watch the many hours worth of recordings, but may find it helpful to be signposted towards things that they may well want to watch. And equally, although I was going to sort of kick this off, I'm sure others on this call who also attended would have gone to sessions that I didn't. So we'll be aware of stuff that's really interesting that I didn't sort of pick up on. So hopefully we will collectively benefit from some knowledge sharing. And we'll see what else comes up. So that's going to be the main focus of the call, but I'll happily take input from anyone on anything else that we wish to talk about this week as well. But in that spirit, let's kick off just sort of stepping through some of the agenda from IETF 111, and I think pretty much all of the session sort of recordings should be up now, and I think some of the working groups have got the final version of the meeting notes up as well, but at the very least the drafts should be available for perusal too, plus all the relevant other meeting materials. But stepping through the sessions, I'm going to do these in the agenda order that they came up. So starting with Monday, the sort of first session that I joined on Monday was the PEARG, which I'm hurriedly looking up because I keep forgetting what it stands for. It's the Privacy Enhancements and Assessments Research Group. Which was one of the work group sessions in Monday's session 1. And there were 3 components within that working group or research group session which were of interest to me, which were Tommy Pauly gave some further detail on the Apple's private relay service, so it's well worth watching for that if private relays are of interest to you. Not overly long, and that was towards the start of the research group session, so that's definitely worth watching just to get some further technical details on the private relay service. There was also an interesting session on website fingerprinting, and some automated tools, or an automated tool that sort of did some website fingerprinting, and it was comparing and contrasting the difference between TLS and Quick. So again, that's I think worth watching if privacy is of interest to you. And similarly, that there was a session on Flock, and an update on some of the Google proposals on that. So again, if privacy is your thing, then that's sort of well worth watching. So, and all of those, as I say, were within the PEARG session, firstly on Monday. Also on Monday, the sort of DNS Ops had the first of its 2 sessions. Quite a lot of content in there. The 2 components that stood out to me, one was on DNSSEC automation. I know DNSSEC is definitely of interest to some of the people on this call, so that's I think worth just looking out for. And there were 2 papers presented by Dan Wing on the sort of DNS error page, which triggered quite an extensive discussion. And I think that, again, is definitely worth watching to sort of get the working group's take on those. And I suspect the discussion that was triggered on the sort of DNS error page will continue, because there were, I think it's fair to say, mixed views on the proposal, with I think some people suggesting it would appear as if IETF were these proposals go forward was endorsing DNS censorship, whereas others were took it that it was giving more transparency to sort of DNS-based content filtering. So if you want to get a good sense of the difference in views, including from the AD in that particular session, I think it's well worth watching for that. And then finally, on Monday, there was the SEC dispatch session. There was a discussion and a draft on a definition of end-to-end encryption, which is being worked up. And certainly, I think for a few people on this call, that's well worth looking at. The presentation was, or the discussion was interesting, but I think that's a draft that is well worth people looking into if it's passed you by, as the intent is to publish an IETF-backed definition of end-to-end encryption, which, to heavily summarize what was discussed, I think Mallory Nodal, one of the authors of the draft, was keen, for example, that it wouldn't count as end-to-end encryption if things like key escrow were part of what a service was doing. So she wanted a completely guaranteed privacy, if you will, with no ability to retrospectively break into it in any way by anyone. So I think it's worth watching the session if you can, but definitely worth looking at the draft for that. So those are all the things I took out from Monday. If I just pause for a moment just for breath, I don't know if anyone either caught any of those and has any comments, or if anyone sort of picked up on any of the sessions from Monday that they think it's worth highlighting for other people to look at.
I thought it was brave to present federated learning of cohorts, which is essentially a system of slightly reducing privacy to the privacy research group. The reception was not throwing tomatoes at them, but it was interesting.
Yes, I suppose probably safer to present it to a research group than one of the livelier groups, to be fair, Chris. But yeah, that's a good observation. Anyone else with any other observations from, as I say, either any of those or anything else from Monday before I move on to Tuesday? And feel free to put things in the chat as well if that's easier. In which case I'll move on to Tuesday. Only two sessions there to highlight, at least from my point of view. One was in the security area discussion, working group. There was I think quite a useful discussion about post-quantum security. So for those of you particularly interested in encryption, sort of how that might pan out in the medium term, then that was quite interesting, with different views on the time frame when quantum computing might come more to the fore in a relevant sense. And as always, some quite knowledgeable people contributing to the discussion on that. So useful to learn a bit more about sort of progress with quantum computing, if nothing else. And then probably the highlight on Tuesday was the Oblivious BOF which I think was quite a lively discussion. Covering a range of aspects of the oblivious HTTP proposal. From my perspective, I'd say that there was an effort, I think, by the authors of the proposal, or proponents, if you will, of the BOF, to try and keep to a very streamlined charter with just a single milestone. And there was some debate and pushback within the discussion as to whether that was the right approach or not. There was certainly a lively debate around whether discovery had a role to play, discovery of proxies, this is in the context of oblivious HTTP. So there was some discussion as to whether that had a role to play for this standard, and if so, whether it was something that an oblivious HTTP working group should be tasked to solve, or whether that was something that could be left for left to be addressed at a later date by somebody or some other group. And I think it's fair to say there were different views expressed, particularly on discovery as well as on other facets of it. And also, I think some confusion had been caused as to what the use case or use cases were that the authors envisaged, as that had some bearing as to what the charter should contain. But
well, it's more than just confusion, isn't it? So it's
being kind, Chris. I'm trying to be reasonably impartial on this.
Yeah, so it's clear that, well, oblivious HTTP is derived from oblivious DNS or DO. Yeah, so oblivious DO can carry DNS messages. The only use case that was articulated that goes beyond DNS was telemetry. You can't use it for web browsing, can't use it for lots of things. So it's really hard to define a charter when it's so unclear about what the use cases are.
Yes, particularly when the last IETF, I think the view was taken that oblivious DO was very narrow and therefore wasn't worth pursuing, given the impending oblivious HTTP proposal, which was far more all-encompassing, and therefore the IETF should invest its efforts in that rather than oblivious DO.
Well, so Andrew, I mean, that's sort of why I think there was such a problem with that BOF, because if you suddenly say, well, let's not do oblivious DO because we're going to put it as part of a bigger package, which is oblivious HTTP. People go, okay, that's reasonable. But then when you show up at oblivious HTTP, they say, as Chris points out, said, well, we got like a use case. Well, wait a minute. This is supposed to be more encompassing. This is supposed to be bigger. This is supposed to take on a lot of issues and combine them together in some coherent approach. And now you're telling me that you don't have, like, it's really simple and narrow focus. It's like, well, those two are at odds with one another. And I think that's why we got, there's, even today I see there's an ongoing discussion on List around consolidation. Yes. And is this feeding consolidation? Is this protocol-based feeding consolidation potentially? And I think logically that drives a discussion about discovery, but not for the reasons I think that we are having the discussion originally. I think it drives it, discovery for diversity's sake. There's an operational need for discovery. How do you make this actually work? But as I was sort of reading through the messages today about the consolidation and stuff like that, I was trying to think back to examples of things which were harder for people to implement. And so, like, one of the things I think that drives, decentralization is the ability for many people to stand up the exact same service in some form or fashion. How easy is it for you to take this technology and use it? And, HTTP is a great example. It's really easy to stand up a web server. It's really easy to put content out. We have a lot of websites. We have, I'm going to guess millions upon millions upon millions of websites. Even DNS itself is a fairly easy service to stand up. You stand up your, most basic, you stand up your local resolver, and you point it up to the next guy and say, cache what he tells you. And it's a pretty easy service to build upon. But then I look at other services historically, things like, if you remember Radius is an authentication service. And it's used in a lot of places, like enterprises historically would use Radius to authenticate into services on their network. And if you're an old DCE person, the distributed computing environment used Radius-based sort of technology. It was really Kerberos, a similar related stuff to do that kind of stand up in that authentication model. But they were not things that a home user would ever stand up on their own, really. And they were not things that were easy to stand up, either because of you had to pay additional technology fees, or you had to have things in your infrastructure you just couldn't easily get. They were sort of barriers to entry. And as I look for, we talk about the discovery of these things. Well, okay, what's the barrier to entry? If we suddenly require you to have a lot of infrastructure that's tied into a lot of other infrastructure that's tied into business relationships, that's a showstopper somewhat for great diversity. And so I think we ultimately have a philosophical discussion to have. It's like, well, do we build an architecture and a protocol set that really is building upon business relationships and other relationships I have and technology relationships, or do I continue to do what the IETF has done historically? That is, build these protocols. They're easy to roll out. They're easy to implement, and a lot of people can do it without a big investment. And those two things sort of are at odds, and one drives potentially consolidation because bigger players, lower barrier to entry for them because they have the resources, higher barrier to entry for people that don't have those resources.
Yeah. And as you say, the whole premise, the discussion was quite difficult, certainly within that particular working group, because there were different preconceptions as to what the use case was, and therefore what the implications were for all of this. And clearly, in any case, I think there are very different views as to how relevant centralization is, which is, I think, evident on the list in some of the discussion this week, which is partly, without getting ahead of myself, while I raised it at the IETF plenary on Wednesday, because I do think it's an issue which is being underplayed, in my humble opinion, currently. I get overall within the IETF and needs to have more attention paid to it.
Well, one last thing about the discovery and oblivious HTTP. There were some assertions that, well, maybe that's a ADD type function, and I pointed out, and I think I remember Chris Box pointed out on the chat session during that session that in fact the workflows and sort of your goals and your relationships with the parties involved are almost inverted or opposite for ADD versus oblivious oblivious HTTP, because in ADD, we are very much these are relationships. We're going to tell you about them. Trust us. Here's why you can trust us. Here's how things all come together from a sort of trust and authoritative standpoint. And the oblivious HTTP was sort of a different model. It's right. It's I don't want to know certain things, and I want to keep certain things under the cloak and not reveal my my everything. So they're very different, and I think that what's something to bear in mind if this topic comes up again is that these two things are not similar, even though they cross similar technology spaces. They are different model-wise, very much so.
Yeah. And dare I say, if there was a view it should be done within ADD, then presumably there would have needed to have been a discussion with the illustrious ADD chairs in advance.
Well, no, that would never be an IETF tradition.
Fair point.
Do I have to officially disclaim it as well to really seal the deal? But
yeah, okay. How naive.
Hey, can I jump in?
Yes, please. Go on, Jason.
Yeah, I found it very interesting, the different views on the definition of safe browsing in that one. I was like, some people thought safe browsing was content filtering, the other ones thought it was anonymous browsing. And I'm like, somebody needs to have a definition that people actually come to consensus and agree on.
Yeah,
But no, it's just
maybe going back to the session on Monday about the end-to-end encryption definition. Yeah, you're right. Maybe there needs to be a safe browsing definition. So at least using the same words to mean the same things.
yeah, exactly. Because Apple's and Google's definition is 180 degrees opposite.
Yeah. Yeah, which does make it a tad confusing, to say the least.
Well, I did suggest that the group name, if formed, should be oblivious, not safe for work. Because that seemed to fit with some people's definition of what safe browsing was.
Yeah, which is quite different to some of the other ones. And I guess on just reflecting on certainly the diverse views expressed on the Oblivious HTTP working group, I suppose it's worth remembering that ultimately all of the decisions take place on the list. So just because the working group has happened or IETF 111 has happened doesn't mean to say that the decisions are taken. So I guess it's important for people to actually put their views on the list rapidly to try and sort of help shape the discussion further.
Well, I think BCP 25 says consensus comes from the total of what's said in the meeting and what's said on the list.
Yeah. Okay.
Don't forget writing code.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm watching a rabbit outside of my yard right now, and I'm just wondering which of my garden items it's about to try to eat. So if I seem distracted, I'm making eye contact with this rabbit and wondering which of my plants are you going to nibble
on? That's throw my train. I thought I was going to say something there. Oh yes, the other observation, I guess, from that particular session before we move on was I thought it was interesting that was it one of the chairs or AD interjected at the end to say that since there wasn't agreement on discovery, it was clearly in the rough and therefore shouldn't be included. Which I thought, well, that was very much a cup half full, cup half empty sort of argument, because you could make exactly the same point in reverse, that there wasn't agreement that it shouldn't be included either.
Well, at the end of the day, it didn't seem like there was agreement on really anything in that BOF. So
that's true as well.
I'm guessing it's either going to have to go back and rethink, or I don't know. I don't know what they'll do with that, but it didn't seem like there was agreement to move on for sure.
Yeah. Yes, the notes will I think make interesting reading to go back to properly later. So I suppose that the net of all of that is anyone that wasn't sort of able to attend IETF 111 last week, if you have the opportunity, that's definitely a session worth watching the replay of if you have the time. And even for some of us that did attend, it's probably worth watching to the replay to try and actually get a better sense of what was discussed, because it was quite a fast-moving discussion, I think, as well.
Andrew, there was another session on Tuesday, which was actually at the same time as Oblivious HTTP, and that was human rights protocol considerations.
Oh, yes.
I haven't seen it. Presumably none of us have, because we were in the other one, but it covers Internet Governance Forum. And
yes,
so,
actually that's a very good point, because I would have attended that, as it were, had it not clashed with the BOF session. I don't suppose anyone on this call, and this is not meant to be a rhetorical question, so let me rephrase it. Did anyone on this call have the opportunity to attend that, or either live or call to catch up with it retrospectively, out of interest? I'll take silence as no, in which case that's helpful. Chris, I will certainly make a mental note for myself to go back through that, because yeah, I was intrigued to see what they were going to cover on the internet governance. And when I last looked, prior to the session starting, the materials hadn't been made available at that point. So I presume they are now. So yeah, that's a timely prompt to go back and check that one out. Thank you. I mean, to that point, those were the two sessions that I picked up on the Tuesday. Did anyone else sort of note any other interesting sessions that you attended? Silence says no, in which case moving on to Wednesday.
I should say, you know, DNSSD did also meet on Tuesday. And, you know, again, kind of the evolution of DNS inside the home network is something that is really being brought into question by a lot of these efforts.
Yeah. Did you have the opportunity to dip into that one at all, Barbara?
She had to.
Barbara's the chair of DNSSD.
Yeah.
Oh, you were? Okay, fine. Well, in that case, hopefully you did.
Unfortunately, I was not able to avoid it. Yeah.
So would you think would you recommend that as one to catch up on then? I'm guessing you might.
No, I think it's just, you know, there's been you know, for a long time there's been the thought of, you know, how do we evolve and really have a good DNS system inside the local network. And so you've got Anima doing a lot of work on more managed networks. DNSSD kind of helps both. There had been some thought in HomeNet, but I think, you know, the current solution really doesn't play into this area so much. But I, you know, it's just as somebody who's worked on the home network and who's really been a proponent of trying to ensure that people are able to have a home network that is functional, even if the WAN drops. I just get really concerned with so much effort being put into forcing end users to connect to the cloud for every little thing.
Yeah. Yes, because in the event of a dropout, then even your home network stops working, which is not great.
Well, and the privacy concerns, I mean, you know, there's a reason I like Apple, but I don't use iCloud because I don't believe in putting my photographs on the cloud. It's like, oh my God, but okay, it's fine if you want to, but you shouldn't be forced to.
Yeah. Good point.
So yeah, I think the wider question is, what is the role of the local DNS server in a home? Because we have multicast DNS, but we also have a system that is proposed where your printer registers using normal DNS to the local DNS resolver, and it's that kind of thing doesn't really. It's kind of in conflict with, as Barbara was saying, things where DNS is being tunneled out to the internet.
Yeah, which someone.
Well, and on the topic of printing, what about the printing services for some devices that require you to send your print job to the cloud so the cloud can send it to your printer?
Oh no, do they? Oh dear.
Yeah.
If ever there were a privacy violation, yeah.
I mean, that's marginally useful if you happen to be not at home but want to send something to your home printer. But if it does that all the time with all the content, that's clearly not the best approach.
I'm sure nothing could go wrong.
Right. Fine. Okay. Well, there's a second session then that's worth session to catch up on then from the Tuesday. And apologies for not immediately knowing, Barbara, that you were chairing that, but I will certainly look at that one. Again, anyone else with anything else you want to call out from Tuesday before we move on to Wednesday? No, silence has not. Okay, so looking at Wednesday then. Again, there were a few diary clashes here. The session that I sort of dipped into was the TLS working group. So principally because the discussion on ECH continued there amongst other things. And for anyone that hasn't caught up with that yet, I think they're sort of making progress towards draft 13 as well as additional interop testing as well. So that's certainly ECH is progressing at a pace. So that's worth, for those of you with an interest in ECH matters or indeed content filtering, is worth keeping an eye on. The other two that I sort of joined on Wednesday were SHMOO, which is stay home, meet online only, which is of particular interest mainly because Jay, the IETF, the exec director, chief exec, whatever, gave a presentation on sort of some of the interim survey results for what approach to take for IETF 112, which is nominally in Madrid. I think a decision on whether it's going to take place in person or be entirely virtual again will be taken later this month. But he shared some of the survey findings, and that led to a bit of a discussion during that session. Then, of course, there was the IETF plenary with short presentations from the IETF, IESG, IAB, IRTF, and the LLC as well, to throw lots of different acronyms at everyone. And a bit of discussion amongst other things on centralization, and dare I say it, I also raised GitHub again, same as last time. And I note also on Wednesday, but I didn't join them, there was the Madness BOF about MAC address and device identification, and I think MAC randomization, which will be of interest, I think, to some people, but I didn't join it myself, as well as the ANRW sessions, which ran Monday through Wednesday, sort of in parallel with IETF. And there was some presentations on DNS privacy, which took place also during Wednesday. Although I wasn't able to join those sessions live, the presentations were pre-recorded, so I did catch up on those, and they were certainly quite interesting.
So, Andrew, if I can jump in on the MAC address randomization, that's one that I think people are divided into two categories. I haven't looked at it yet, or that doesn't apply to me, who cares? I guess the third category, people are paying attention to it. You know, it is a problem in some environments where, because of what's going on effectively is we have implementations done in some operating systems where they're randomizing the MAC addresses that the devices are putting out. And if you have infrastructure that is based upon, and usually this is like edge infrastructure, that's based upon using awareness of MAC addresses for things like access control or routing decisions, or just, hey, I've got a problem, I need to find this device and fix it. The MAC randomization does create some operational issues for edge networks especially. And so if, you might want to take a look at that as a group, just go off and, just go read the proposals and maybe, I think it was an hour-long session, play the session to hear about some of the use cases they're discussing, because there's a problem space there. It's not as as wild and crazy as DNS discovery, but it's something that actually touches a lot of the stuff that really matters to us, like the edge of the network is kind of important. And so I think a lot of people sort of assume, well, that's not a thing. Yeah, it's a thing. It's breaking things. So we need to sort of find out the happy compromise between the two approaches. And that's what that group, I think, is trying to get started up, is actually looking at, well, what makes sense in what context for when you use randomization, when you don't use randomization, or when you use some kind of hint. So
yeah,
there's my plug.
Yeah, and I think I know it's also a topic within, I think, Etsy, I think, as well, amongst others. So there are various other bodies looking at the topic. So it's certainly been a live issue for the last couple of years or so, I think. But I can say that without being able to have joined the BOF last week, to be fair. But I gather it was somewhat less challenging a discussion, shall we say, than the oblivious HTTP one. There was somewhat more agreement, I believe, but like I said, as I say, without having taken part myself.
I would say it's not as contentious as oblivious HTTP. I'm not sure that there was a clear consensus on the next step forward, but I think it was closer.
Yeah, there was.
What was there, Jason? Sorry, my bad.
Yep. Yeah, there was a consensus to move forward on to make a working group. Right now, we're just working on changing the charter around a little bit to make everyone happy.
Okay, my bad. Sorry to give out misinformation. I think it was early in the week, and it was a long week.
Yeah.
But the results of that working group, it's going to be quick. So it's going to be an analysis of current deployed or available protocols, and then which one of those are able to solve the problem, or things along that. It's not gonna build a protocol. That's not part of the charter.
We can't call it speedy and we can't call it quick, so we're just gonna have to call it fast. Sorry, IETF nerd humor.
And whilst we're talking, I noticed that Nigel commented in the chat as well on the SHMU session that, and I must admit, I didn't pick up on this, but so he felt some of the comments were maybe a bit US centric in parts. I have to rewatch it to see that. So did anyone pick up on any other sessions from the Wednesday which I thought were noteworthy?
Well, I just want to thank you for the summary of the SHMU session, because I was very distracted having to multitask during the SHMU session, where people were discussing about people being distracted by multitasking because I was having to bathe my grandson. But anyway.
Yeah, and I suppose you have to concentrate on that. I would. Well, I vaguely remember from a few years back when I had to bathe mine, Barbara, children, not grandchildren, to be fair, but impressed if you could do that at the same time.
I would say though that the plenary on an iPhone was actually pretty good, which was a surprise to me. I had never tried doing Meet Echo on an iPhone.
Oh, okay, but it worked quite well, did it?
Well, it worked well enough. I did it via Chrome browser. It had some things that were undesirable, but overall, I got it.
It's useful to know. And like, I've never used it on a mobile device at all. I've always used it on my laptop, which is pretty straightforward, to be fair. But yeah, well, good to know it works on mobile devices as well. Okay, if we move on to
Wednesday, we had regex, registry extensions. Not everything DNS there, but registries have a little bit say in the DNS world. So
yeah, I'm just looking to see when that was on Wednesday. Oh yes, session 2.
Yes.
One of
Yes.
those.
Yeah, so I think the bigger one going on, which is I think almost finished, is a reverse search for RDEP. So and I think that is useful even in the IP registry case, where you not just can search for domain name, but you can say, give me all the domains that this registrant owns, or all the IPs space that this registrant owns. And I think there's some discussions about this even in the EU, together with the e-evidence, something that the registries have to be able to do this. So.
Oh, okay. Well, that's useful to know as well, Ulrich. Thank you for highlighting that one. All right, well, let's then move on to Thursday. So the sort of main sessions for me on Thursday at the beginning were the back-to-back deprive sessions, where there was a lengthy discussion about a recursive to authoritative encryption. I think it's safe to say the different views on how to approach that. With I think two of the more active proponents of the different views being Paul Hoffman and Ecker, both shy and retiring, as people that know them both will be aware. So that did ensure there was a pretty lively debate. At one time, I think on the queue, on the mic queue, there were 3 Erics and 2 Pauls in the queue, which was quite humorous, particularly when one of the chairs directed a question at Paul. No, not that Paul, the other Paul, I think was the gist of what he said, which became quite confusing for some of us who were a bit tired. But so that's as the voyage to sort of fixing some of the missing sort of gaps in encryption continues. It's worth catching up on the recursive to authoritative discussion if that's of interest to you and you weren't able to join the sessions.
You said there were opposing views, like should encrypt versus not encrypt, or different ways of encrypting?
Should authenticate versus don't authenticate.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
There was opportunistic, I think was the approach that Paul Hoffman was advocating in particular, whereas Ecker's approach was I think rather stricter than that, but they kept on missing so whether there was any appetite within the authoritatives to actually implement, which in my view is actually quite important as well, to discuss something around whether they feel like the end users, which in this case would be the authorities themselves, actually want to take this on board. I think there was a throwaway comment at one point that there was no likelihood of them doing anything in the next decade, which, if that's true, I think it's actually quite important.
Well, on behalf of a large authoritative operator, I would implement it as soon as I know how to.
Okay.
Just need a spec.
In that case, well worth your while watching the replay then, Brian, to probably get a sense of the discussion. And to clarify a question in the chat, which was directed just at me, I think I said about Ecker being shy and retiring, not that he's retiring, so I'm not wanting to start a rumour. In case anyone got the wrong information on that. Anyway, so Ralph, you've been waiting patiently, so you wanted to come in.
Yeah, on deprive, I mean, pretty much everything there was up for discussions. I mean, unauthenticated, authenticated, then how to authenticate using kind of web PKI or DNSSEC, then how to actually signal that stuff from the parent, use an existing record, abuse it, or use a new record. And it was really, I mean, abandoned the requirements draft, but I never seen actually a working group in need for what are we actually going to achieve here, because at the moment it's running in all directions, and I unfortunately see no, I mean, unless we consolidate on something, the way forward will be hard.
Yeah.
Because of these opposing views.
Yeah, there seems, yeah, there was a big divergence of views, clearly, wasn't there? I mean, it wasn't quite as pointed a discussion, I don't think, Ralph, as the oblivious HTTP, but there was certainly a lot of differences in how to move forward on this. Yeah, and also see John's comment in the chat about Bill being a proponent of it. I think I might say Bill was in the discussion. I think.
Yeah.
I might be misremembering.
And even with many of the authoritative operators that I've discussed this with informally about how to do recursive to authoritative, there's been a strong interest in it. So I'm not sure who the reference is. Authoritatives wouldn't do it? I'm sure there are some that wouldn't because they don't have the ability or the resources to do it. But I think the larger ones, meaning probably the majority of query traffic, would be encrypted relatively quickly, but that's just a guess.
Yeah, it may have been, to be fair, John, some particular facet that was someone was suggesting would be a challenge, because I know in some of the list discussions previously they said that some things would be contrary to some of the license conditions, which obviously is quite important. They wouldn't want to lose their contracts over. Ralph might have a better recollection of that if you ever wanted to come back in, Ralph, because it's a subject.
Yeah, so VeriSign pretty much said they're not going to do it. Which kind of is the biggest TLD common net, leaving them out. And I believe going forward, it probably will be, or hopefully will be, the same story with DNSSEC, with some of the smaller TLDs or maybe country TLDs like SE or ZSEC going forward and doing stuff, with the larger ones coming probably later in the game.
Yeah. So definitely, I'd recommend people, if that's a topic of interest, well worth watching the replay on that, as well as obviously comments on the list as well, if you have the appetite and the time. Yeah, and then the sort of DNS op was the other session I caught up with on Thursday, which was a continuation from the sessions earlier in the week, just looking at some of the additional views on how to prioritize the ongoing work, amongst other things. I must admit I was struggling sleep-wise on Thursday, so my recollection of the discussion is less clear. So I'll need to watch the replay myself on that one, just to properly catch up. Again, if there's anything anyone else wants to call out from Thursday, do either jump in or put it in the chat as you see fit. Otherwise, I'll move on to Friday. And again, I think there's quite a good sort of discussion, quite wide-ranging, on the ADD working group, which covered quite a few papers, well within the allotted time. I think triggered useful debate, albeit wasn't completely harmonious all of the time, but I guess that won't be a surprise to anyone. And personally, I thought it was really helpful, Barbara and Chris tabling the paper, just trying to sort of properly document the sort of user requirements and the different scenarios, to at least give a bit more structure to the discussion. But since quite a few people on this call were involved in that session, we'll probably pause there and see if anyone else wants to jump in with their take on how the session went, and any particular highlights, rather than me rambling on.
Well, I was going to just say that I think that the chairs were masterful. So kudos to them for really shepherding this discussion in a constructive way.
Almost goes without saying, Dave. I think it was. Well, to be
I
fair,
would like to offer a counter opinion. Those buffoons couldn't get themselves out of a wet paper bag.
Given the number of papers, I was pretty impressed actually that I think we wound up with a few minutes to spare, which was I think quite a big achievement in all honesty.
Well, the people that presented did a great job. I mean, they stuck to their allotted times, and you know, and the comments I think were very focused. I think, you know, overall, I will say the EDD group has, I think, reached a great level of maturity, and it works really well. All the membership works really well. If you imagine where we started out 3 years ago, and that's a great place to be. I'm very happy with where we've ended up.
Yeah. Any observations from anyone else on that?
Yeah, so, you know, I've been trying to mull over how, you know, I mean, I think, Glenn, you were pretty clear, and, you know, we've seen this, that we're not going to get any best practices. It's pretty obvious to me that probably DDS and the DNR mechanisms are going to proceed without any substantive support for the home network use case. And so they'll be fairly irrelevant, you know, in the context of where there's a DNS forwarder. And some of the comments people made were just ridiculous of, oh, well, you can change your forwarder if you're the ISP. You know, actually, a lot of ISPs have a difficult time doing that too, but that's beside the point. So I am wondering if maybe this is where we sort of re-enliven the EDD. What is this group you were part of that Jason started? Living Good, that is, and maybe create some best practices in there around what we would recommend applications do relative to DNS discovery and all this DNS over HTTPS. What are your thoughts?
Well, so I mean, since I've got two hats on here, within the context of EDDI, that certainly is something we could do. You know, the group can come together. You know, the membership of EDDI tends to be sort of split between there's policy people in there, but there's also you know, edge network deployment operator type people that are in EDDI. That would be a great place to do it. For those who are on both the EDD list and the EDDI list, ahead of IETF 111, I sent out a sort of a nudge email to the EDDI list saying, hey, there's a bunch of stuff going on in EDDI or in ADD that you guys should probably start paying attention to because it's time. And, you know, if you're going to deploy, here's the time to discuss it. That said, I do think there's room within the ADD charter because there is if you look in the charter, there is a statement that one of the other outputs is a like informational document that the ADD group is chartered to produce. That could easily be staying within the bounds of not getting into telling people what they have to do and how they have to do it from a UI perspective. That's always the third rail, right? But certainly, you know, talking about the issues and about the technologies that are in the ADD and how you can adopt them and make use of them, like sort of a, you know, here's possibilities that you can consider. You know, that I think if scoped the right way and done with, you know, the third rail in mind, could possibly be done. I think one of the big challenges, I'll get Dave a chance to say something about it too, but I think one of the challenges we have right now is that we need some people to come forward and write these things and say, hey, that's something I care about, I want to write it. Because, you know, the IETF doesn't work by commissioning work, they work by managing the process for people that are bringing things into the group. So, Tail, your thoughts?
No, I don't really have anything to add to that. That's pretty spot on, right? And one of the perpetual challenges of the IETF.
Well,
in that there are a lot of great thoughts that don't ever seem to make it into documents we can work with.
so, and here's a question of mine. Every protocol I know of has some configurable elements to it. I mean, DHCP clients can be configured and there are configuration parameters defined. DNS clients can be configured and there are configuration parameters defined within, some of the specifications of the protocol. And yet, every time configuration parameters are suggested around any of these discovery protocols, it's called user interface, and user interface is out of scope. And so therefore, we're saying we are not going to allow definition of any parameters that a user might be permitted to configure, thereby ensuring the user has zero control over these protocols.
And that's something, Barbara, I was going to say, that's something that when the charter was being drafted, the people that, to get over the final hurdle, if you notice, it talks about conveyance, like, the group will develop, conveyance of this information. And they sort of, and it's not one person, it's just the way the charter came together to get it over the final hurdle. It became a conveyance protocol, not a workflow where we control both ends of the conversation, the server and the client, and all pieces in between. We just got the piece in between instead of either end. We're sort of capped, not doing with the ends. I agree with it's a limitation, but it's a limitation we were imposed upon. If we wanted to undo that, then we have to go back, I guess, to the ISG and to the community and say, we want to expand the scope here and do these other things too.
Or I'm fine if we define it in EDDI or broadband forum. I am more than happy to move any and all work away from IETF, where it's honestly not my favorite.
Would it be legitimate to cover that within a informational document without being prescriptive about it, Glenn or Dave? Or do you think that would be too far, given the limitations on the charter?
I'd have to go look at the wording. I mean, it's potentially, like I say, if you can avoid the hard parts of the third rail, you could probably get away with, like, here are considerations that, implementers should think about from their perspective. And here's, and without being prescriptive or either prescriptive or proscriptive about what you could choose, see, here's ideas, here's options, here's approaches of how this information, could or could not be used. But it's up to you, right? That might fit within the charter. We'd have to go look at and do a fine-tooth comb look at it, see if it did or it didn't, depending upon where that document went.
Yeah, that's so watered down as to be useful. I'd rather do it elsewhere. Useless to that. Which word did I say?
The Eddie mailing list exists, and we can certainly organize something there too, Barbara.
Yeah, and I might try it on Eddie then.
Yeah, and then there are no limitations, which makes it easier.
Well, there's one limitation. The one rule I always impose upon Eddie: be kind to everybody else.
Yeah, fair.
Yes, I agree with that one.
Okay. Right, and I'm just conscious of the time, so apologies if we've run over slightly, but just briefly, at that point, that was the end of my IETF 111 engagement. I dipped in briefly into the MAPRG research group, measurement and analysis for protocols group, but decided that sleep was becoming pressing at that point after sort of 4 late nights in a row. So sort of tuned out partway through, which is not any reflection on the content. Any final highlights from anyone from Friday that they think is worth signposting for others to look at?
It wasn't Friday, but I can't remember if you mentioned it, but the mask work group on Monday was also pretty interesting. If you think if everything's moving too quick, that's a good one to get involved with.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I seem to recall there was some applause for private relay at the beginning of that as being an early widespread deployment of mask.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, good point, which I think Tommy did mention possibly in the PARG presentation, I think, as well. So that's maybe why then. Okay. Right, we are slightly over time, but I just pause then at that point and say, well, hopefully that was useful to people. I was going to say any other business, but let me just go to Nigel first, as he's just raised his hand. So do you want to unmute Nigel? You're not unmuted, I don't think. Well, you might be muted locally. You are unmuted according to Zoom. We'll try again.
Does that work?
That does work.
I'm so sorry, delaying you. Yeah, so sorry. No, I came in a bit late to the discussion, so you might have covered the end-to-end encryption session. I thought it was on Tuesday or Wednesday, but it might have been on Monday even. It's amazing how you forget.
It was Monday. Sec dispatch.
I'm so sorry. So you did cover it, and you said, well, I mean, it was quite interesting, wasn't it? But I mean, yeah.
Yes, and definitely I would commend people to actually read the document. I think it's well worth reading and commenting on, as potentially it's quite a strict definition in the current draft, in my view. So yeah. Yep. Okay, well, before we wind up then, just sort of briefly then, did anyone have anything else you wanted to raise this week, having spent quite a long time signposting some interesting content from last week's IETF 111? I'll take it. Probably not. I think, to be fair, for most of us, that did fill a lot of our weeks last week, one way or another. So, okay, well, in that case, let's call a halt there. So thanks, everyone. I hope that was useful. Certainly, I've noted a few things to go back to catch up on. So I hope everyone will get some value from that. So with that in mind, have a fantastic week, and we'll catch up again same time next week. So thanks all for your time.